Good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are kicking off the new year in Spy Chat with some superlative speakers. We have my esteemed boss, Chris Costa, the Executive Director of the International Spy Museum. Chris will be leading the conversation. Today, he's joined by John Brennan, who served as President Obama's Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor from 2009 to 2012, and as Director of the Central Intelligence Agency from 2013 to 2017. Director Brennan previously had a 25-year CIA career, which included stints as President Clinton's daily intelligence briefer, CIA station chief in the Middle East, Chief of Staff to CIA Director George Tenet, and he was the first director of the National Counterterrorism Center when it was established in 2004. He is the author of Undaunted, My Fight Against America's Enemies at Home and Abroad, and we do have that for sale via the Spy Museum store. You'll see a link in the chat. John is currently a senior national security and intelligence analyst for NBC News and MSNBC and serves as a visiting distinguished fellow at Fordham University Law School and the University of Texas at Austin. Chris and John are going to talk about the topics that are on their minds right now. I know a lot of us are focused on one or two issues. They are tracking other intelligence issues as well. But I think the focus is going to be on moving quickly through the headlines, and then we'll get to a lot of your questions, and we're going to get to as many of them as we possibly can. Before I turn it over to Chris, I cannot thank enough our really incredible sponsor, Accenture Federal Services. Accenture has been so helpful to us at the Spy Museum, so supportive, especially our governing board member, Tracy Easler, and Lieutenant General Mary Legere. They're involved with Accenture. They have supported the Spy Museum. And as we all continue to struggle with issues in the pandemic, they have kept us going and enabled us to have programs like this. So enough from me, over to you, Chris Costa.
Okay, thank you very much, Amanda. Happy New Year, everyone. We want to accomplish three things this morning. We want to offer some thoughts on national security stories that we are tracking, and there are a lot of them. We also want to talk a little bit about Undaunted, an excellent memoir by John Brennan. And as Amanda already said, we want to spend some time, maybe a lot, 30 minutes or so, for your questions and your answers. I'm sorry, our answers, your questions, right? So the number one story that I'm tracking is probably very obvious to people tuning in today. And that story is a very big story. It's a developing story. It's the breach of the Capitol that played out last week. As I said, it's a developing story, and it started developing perhaps 4 years ago, arguably, with polarization, disinformation by foreign Russian adversaries exploiting social media, as well as other foreign adversaries, Chinese, as well as the Iranians. And there is significant uptick in inflamed passions. This all led to political violence. Some number of Americans moved from political activism. They crossed the threshold to political violence. And that's a very important point. And make no mistake, there was political violence last week. Pipe bombs, zip ties for potential hostages, killing a Capitol police officer, an individual by the name of Brian Sicknick, Molotov cocktails. All of this goes well beyond political mischief. Incitement of insurrection, sedition. This is a very important story. And there was a question early on, is this an intelligence failure? Arguably, as this continues to play out, I would make the case that it's not an intelligence failure. It seems that there was adequate intelligence. Why the Capitol wasn't hardened, that's an open question right now. It's obviously going to be studied, and there needs to be some kind of commission, in my humble opinion, to look at this, similar to the way there was a commission in the aftermath of 9/11. Also, there's another problem that I will just offer here, and that is the idea, the very notion of an insider threat, so a counterintelligence threat, where individuals complicit in the Capitol, employees or other individuals providing intelligence, doing support to reconnaissance, pre-operational preparation that we see in advance of any terrorist attack, unless it's spontaneous, which is relatively rare. So these are the things that we need to pay attention to going forward. So I don't want to belabor the point because I know we're going to talk more about this in our questions and answers. The second story that I'm tracking is a very important story that broke out in the end of 2021. And this is a cyber intrusion perpetrated by all accounts by Russians. But this wasn't about disrupting infrastructure. This was about Russia's foreign intelligence service, their arm being the SVR. In essence, it was as if the SVR broke into government agencies, burglarized it, and they're still present. That is the best analogy I can offer. And I wish I could say it's my analogy, but they're still in the house that they essentially stole from. And we don't know how long they've been there exactly. There's been some reporting in the press that this has been ongoing for the last 6 months. And it's not just government intrusions, it's also Fortune 500 companies. And I think many of you already know that some of this happened because of what they call supply chain attacks, meaning software updates where hacking and hackers were able to exploit that, use software updates, get into the systems. So I'm not going to get into the technical intricacies. That's not my expertise. But I will flag for you that an excellent op-ed was written by Mr. Tom Bosser, who's going to be joining us next month. He actually served in the same position as the Homeland Security Advisor, the Counterterrorism Advisor, and the Cyber Czar in the first year of the administration. He was actually my boss. So that's a very important story, and it seems to be overshadowed, obviously, by the Capitol breach last week, but it's an important story to track, and it's a very serious escalation. From a counterintelligence standpoint, the story that I'm tracking, we talked about that a little bit last month during Spy Chat. It's the idea of Andre Lesage, the idea that some people want to pardon him. I've heard some appeals. There's been some people in peaceful protests in DC, separate protests advocating for his release from jail and his ultimate pardon. Well, last week, a judge denied his extradition to the United States. If you remember, Andre Lesage in 2010 published documents by the former US Army intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning. Those documents were sensitive information, classified information. There are 17 charges the United States government would like to see Lesage face. But because of his mental state, it seems that the UK is not going to allow him face justice here in the United States. But that's something to pay attention to. Another story on a counterterrorism front, excuse me, very important, that broke out in December. It's of great interest to me. The headline was Pentagon weighs sharp drawbacks in support of CIA for the counterterrorism fights that we're engaging overseas. Now, today we'll probably talk a lot about domestic terrorism, but to be sure, our fight overseas is not going to go away. We still are concerned about al-Shabaab. We're still concerned about ISIS affiliates and al-Qaeda affiliates in West Africa, in Afghanistan, in Syria. ISIS has certainly gone aground, but they're rebuilding. So we have an overseas fight. I was rather surprised that there's a review underway looking at perhaps throttling back some of Pentagon's resources that they provide to support CIA. And I think it's very important not to decrement resources. To be sure, it's okay to do a review, certainly, but I'm very concerned about what happens down the line with that particular review. Certainly, decisions can be reversed. Those are decisions for future administrations to make. The final story I want to flag, and I know John Brennan has spent a lot of time, it's an emotional issue for many people in the US government that work on hostages. We know the hostage families. There are hostages being held right now overseas. We know those families. So there was some good news in that recently the United States sanctioned 2 Iranian intelligence officers from the MOIS, sanctioned them for their complicity for capturing or abducting Bob Levinson off Kish Island in 2007. Now, we believe, and it's probable, that Bob Levinson, a former FBI agent, tragically died in captivity. The Iranians have never publicly acknowledged it. So it's good that the United States has sanctioned these intelligence officers because the Iranians are complicit. So I would like to close out with kind of a happy, sad story, and it has to do with John Le Carre passing away at 89 years old, I think just a few weeks ago. Le Carre, of course, wrote some stories, fiction stories, plethora of stories about intelligence operations. He's a former MI5, so a British Security Service officer, and an SIS officer, Secret Intelligence Service from the MI6. Le Carre wrote, as I said, many books, and I wanted to offer for the audience, since he is now gone, I would just like to offer my advocacy for my favorite Le Carre book. It's called A Most Wanted Man. It's about the moral ambiguities of doing counterterrorism work post 9/11, and I think it's an important story. So I'll turn it over to John to hear his insights, and then we'll talk a little bit about Undaunted, and then we'll open it up to questions. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Chris. And first of all, I want to thank you and Amanda and all of the Spy Museum staff for the very kind invitation for me to participate in today's program. Then also to thank Accenture. Sponsors of such events are so critically important. And I know Accenture over the years has done a lot to try to support public service through their sponsorship of events such as this. Yeah, there's so much in the news these days. There's so much to talk about. And I think, obviously, all of us are very concerned about what happened at the Capitol last week. Like you, there still are, I feel, a lot of questions that need to be answered and asked. And not only just the criminal investigation needs to continue to bring to justice those individuals who assaulted the Capitol in criminal fashion, but also I think there needs to be a more thorough, comprehensive strategic review, such as like the commission, as you pointed out, to understand why we got to that point last week where the lives of so many of our members of Congress were really at risk, and how the security perimeter was breached, and there was so many individuals who were roaming the corridors and the offices of the Capitol with relative impunity until they were driven out. Like you, I do not believe it was an intelligence failure, at least from what I have seen. I think over the last number of years, we have had the barometric readings that I think were coming to a bit of a crescendo in the days leading up to that assault on the Capitol, that I think clearly would have indicated to folks that there was going to be a real problem in DC. And even though the group initially organized themselves and were located near the White House, clearly their ire was being directed at the Capitol and what was taking place that day, which was the certification of the electoral votes. And so when I looked at the ongoing assault, and I saw how little physical preparation was done, as far as very limited barricades and other types of things, I do think there was a breakdown in the planning and preparation in advance of the events that day. It may have been the waning days of the administration, that the White House was clearly distracted, and that individuals who I think have the responsibility to be interacting with the security officials, both of the federal government as well as the local and at the Capitol, were not doing what they needed to do. When I was the Homeland Security Advisor, I was on the phone a number of times with the head of Capitol Police, Attorney Terry Gaynor, and the Senate Sergeant at Arms, as well as the House Sergeant at Arms. If there was an event that was going to be taking place at the Capitol that either the president was going to be at, or that the White House had a very, very strong interest in ensuring that there was going to be appropriate security in place. And so the coordination as well as synchronization between the federal departments and agencies, FBI, Secret Service, the Department of Homeland Security, as well as with the local authorities, Capitol Police, DC Police, ensuring that there was going to be the contingency plans in the event of a major challenge that the local law enforcement there were unable to defend against. Where were those resources, those reinforcements that were going to come in? So I do think that in light of the seriousness of it, we could have seen a decapitation basically of the legislative branch, but the vice president was also there. And so this is something that has to be looked at very, very intensely, and steps have to be taken to ensure nothing like this ever happens again. And I know that the authorities are now taking a close look at it, and I know that the individuals who are coming in with the Biden administration are going to be focusing on this as soon as they hit the ground next week after the inauguration. So I think this is something that we still have to stay very much focused on. You mentioned about the cyber intrusions. Clearly, at least from what I've been reading in the press, is the extent of this intrusion may have been, in fact, the most serious breach, most damaging breach we've ever faced as a government. And it's not just the government systems and networks that seem to have been penetrated by what appears to be the work of the Russian SVR, which is the rough equivalent of the CIA in the Russian government. The SVR, along with their sister intel and security organizations in Russia, the GRU, which is military intelligence, and then the FSB, which is the domestic Russian security service, they are among the world's most sophisticated cyber actors. And the fact that the SVR was able to penetrate, as Chris mentioned, apparently using software updates going in through a commercial vendor to be able to penetrate the networks. Again, these were unclassified US government networks, but still they contain a lot of very sensitive information that we don't want to have exposed to the Russians. The fact that they were able to be in these systems networks for so long and in a number of departments and agencies, and it's still unclear, and I'm sure it's unclear to the cyber security experts in the government, the extent of the damage that was done. Was it purely a intelligence collection effort to try to acquire as much data and information as possible that they could extract? And they extracted it through a sophisticated way that was able to avoid the various defenses that the US government has in place? Or did they do something more nefarious in terms of leaving behind some malware that could be exploited at some future point to disable or destroy systems and networks? So the fact that there's so much activity takes place in that digital environment, and the US government relies so heavily on that digital domain, the systems, networks, and databases that they have. This is a real serious violation of those organizations. And I know that there are criminal investigations going on, and it is a concern whether or not they had some type of insider help, whether it be in the private sector company that was involved in the updates or inside of the US government. When I was in the government, we had a number of episodes that we had to deal with in terms of Russian intrusions into the computer systems and networks. And the most important thing, as soon as it's discovered, is to try to stop whatever proliferation and propagation of this malware within the systems, but then also to try to understand exactly the extent of the damage. So I think that damage assessment is still ongoing, and I'm hoping that the risks and threat has been mitigated to the greatest extent possible. As far as Julian Assange, I do not believe that he should be granted any type of pardon or release. Yes, he published a number of very sensitive reports that he had access to. But my concern, and I think the reason why he is being prosecuted, is that he provided active assistance to Chelsea Manning and others to criminally intrude in these systems and networks and then extract the information. The fact that he was actively engaged in that type of activity, I think it makes him different than a journalist or reporter or somebody in the media who is merely the recipient of sensitive information. So I do believe that Assange should be held to the full extent of the law in terms of whatever type of prosecution and conviction that he deserves. But it looks as though that the United States courts are not going to have access to him at this point because the British have decided not to send him to the United States, extradite him to the United States for prosecution. I was involved for many, many years on the counterterrorism fight in the United States against foreign terrorists. And one of the things I want to underscore that Chris was referring to was the very important and close cooperation that existed between the U.S. military and the Central Intelligence Agency in the counterterrorism effort around the globe. The CIA depends very heavily on the capabilities of the U.S. military. A lot of times when the CIA officers and capabilities are deployed overseas, the U.S. military is right there with us because we rely on the tremendous capabilities, both in terms of transport, medical services, assistance, intelligence cooperation and sharing. And so I really do hope that as the Biden administration comes in, there's going to be a fresh look at that counterterrorism effort that is undertaken by the CIA and the Department of Defense, and to ensure that there is as close coordination as possible. That doesn't mean that everything that the CIA is involved in or the DoD is involved in, the other needs to be embedded in. But it just means that there needs to be complementary efforts as well as integrated efforts as necessary and appropriate in different parts of the world. And any type of unilateral withdrawal from that counterterrorism fight by one organization or the other without appropriate consultation and coordination in advance, that is very dangerous, not only to the counterterrorism fight, but to the U.S. Either military as well as US CIA officers who are involved in that. A lot of concern about U.S. hostage taking abroad in terms of U.S. citizens, either private citizens or diplomats who are targeted because they are American. And I was involved during my time, both at the White House and at CIA, in doing everything possible to try to leverage U.S. government capabilities to find out where these hostages were being held and do our very best to try to bring them home to their families. And unfortunately, these hostage takers frequently do not want to engage with the United States. They are making their points, and they want to keep these hostages for a variety of reasons, either to get information out of them. Sometimes they're not interested in releasing them under any conditions. But the families, the pain and suffering that the families go through, as well as the individuals themselves, is something that really is quite heart-wrenching. And I know that individuals within the Trump administration were heavily involved in these efforts. I know that Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor, even before he became National Security Advisor, had worked very closely with these families. And I think that is so critically important to continue. Unfortunately, the status of a number of these individuals is still unknown. Austin Tice, who probably was taken by the Syrians a number of years ago, is one of the individuals that I was heavily involved in trying to ascertain exactly his status, his whereabouts, and do what we could to try to get him out safely. And unfortunately, it has not happened. And like Chris, the Levinson family has been through absolute hell over the last decade or so, as Bob's fate, unfortunately, it looks like he is not going to be able to come home to his family. There are so many challenges in the global stage facing the United States. And the United States has very unique responsibilities, I think unlike any other country around the world in terms of its global leadership role. And I know that the Biden administration, the incoming officials, are fully aware of the magnitude of these challenges that they face. I am so happy that so many of my friends and former colleagues who I worked with in the government over the course of many years are returning to public service and are sacrificing, and their families as well, because of the tremendous requirements that they're going to face in the jobs in terms of long hours and frequently having to travel overseas. But I am confident that these individuals are going to carry out the responsibilities with tremendous rigor, focus, and integrity. It ranges from all the issues that we've talked about today in terms of terrorism, hostage taking. We have important relationships around the globe with allies and partners, as well as the need to be able to engage in constructive dialogue with China, Russia, and Iran, I would argue. And so the plate is going to be very full for the Biden administration. They're going to have to go through a process in the first 6 to 9 months of taking inventory of the global landscape, prioritizing the issues that they want to focus on, and then ensuring that my old organization, CIA, and the intelligence community overall are going to be postured in order to support those discussions that need to take place in the White House about the policy initiatives that the Biden administration is going to pursue in order to protect as well as to strengthen U.S. national security interests around the world. And so I really do think it's important, particularly in this period of unfortunate divisiveness in our country, polarization, disinformation, that there be as much transparency as possible in terms of what the government is involved in. I was a strong advocate of transparency when I was in the Obama administration. That's why I think programs like this that are trying to inform, educate the American public about the challenges that are out there, as well as the opportunities, and to ensure that there's not going to be misunderstandings about a lot of these issues that I think we as American citizens should become more familiar with, so that when we go to the voting booth, we're able to vote for those individuals that we think are best able to protect this great country of ours. And then finally, this is such an unusual time for so many reasons, but clearly the COVID-19 challenge and the economic implications of that here in the United States and around the world further complicate an already a difficult security environment. And so therefore, I'm hoping that 2021 is not only going to bring us some relief from the standpoint of the acrimony, I think, that we've seen, unfortunately, recently, but also is going to bring some relief as far as the COVID-19 challenge that we have faced for so long. And so one of the reasons why I wrote Undaunted was to try to lift the shroud off of my intelligence career of 33 plus years working in intelligence and national security, to try to share some of my experiences, some of the lessons that I learned, and then also to encourage young Americans to think very seriously about careers in public service, whether it be in intelligence or military or diplomacy, or working in state and local governments. This is a wonderful country, and I think we all have, as individuals, have a responsibility to try to give back to our country in one form or another. And I think, very unfortunately, our country's reputation and image, even here in the United States, has been affected by what happened at the Capitol building last week. That is not who we are as a country. We, I think, represent certainly the world's oldest and I think most powerful democracy that this world has ever known. And so to the extent that our institutions of government, law enforcement, intelligence, diplomacy, military, and legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government, the fact that we have the ability to tap into this wonderful melting pot known as America to ensure that we have the best and brightest in those institutions is something that I think we really need to ensure takes place. And so therefore, again, my book Undaunted was an opportunity to shed a little bit of light on at least one person's career and how I was so fortunate not only to become director of CIA, but also to witness so much history during my career.
Hey, John, that was terrific. Thank you very much. And again, I want to reinforce it's a privilege to have you here today, and it's a privilege to talk about your book, Undaunted. What I'd like to do, since we can cover Undaunted during the questions and answers, I really want to yield more time to our audience because I think there are so many important issues. I do want to underscore the point, though, that I really enjoyed your memoirs on a human level. I really appreciate the fact that, as Charlie Savage said from the New York Times, it's a rich portrait from your humble roots. Growing up in New Jersey, working class, you ended up interacting with kings and princes. You knew about Al Qaeda before it was a household word. You worked post 9/11, some really, really controversial issues. And I know what it's like to get up every day and go to the White House compound. It's exhausting, and I think you did it for 8 years. And then you went to become the director of CIA. So thanks for all your service. So Amanda, what I want to do, because I am sure we have a range of questions, let's just go to questions and answers.
That sounds great. Thanks for doing that. Not to give love to Undaunted because it's amazing. And I encourage everyone to listen to it or read it. But we have such excellent and diverse questions. I think I'll try to lump them. I'm going to start off with the breach of the Capitol, but we have very diverse questions. One of our guests suggested both of you have said this was not an intelligence failure, but I guess it was a failure or it was a lack of belief on the part of the consumers of the intelligence. What kind of accountability is there for there was good intelligence, but nothing was done with it?
It's a good question. And, intelligence is not an end in itself. Intelligence is something that is to be used, operationalized, leveraged. And so when I said that it doesn't appear to be an intelligence failure, it's because what I've seen in the press and what also I'm just aware of, personally, is that there was, I think, knowledge about this growing sort of climax that was going to manifest itself in the Capitol. But the intelligence itself, in terms of what some individuals might have been doing, it might have been acquired at the local level, but I don't know how far it went in terms of getting up the chain of command. So I think the distribution and dissemination of the intelligence needs to be looked at. Did it get into the right hands? What did people do with it? Was there analysis done? Was it dismissed? Again, how was that intelligence used? And just like as they look back on the 9/11 attacks, you have to look at whether or not that intelligence made its way to the right places, and then that intelligence can be pieced together. Because what you're trying to do is to bring seemingly disparate bits and pieces of information together to create new knowledge to give you then the insight that you need in order to take these appropriate steps. So again, I just think it rather than speculate now where things broke down, I think there needs to be a very comprehensive review about exactly what was known, what happened with that information, and what did people do or not do as a result.
Yeah, I don't have much to add in addition to what John said. I agree and concur wholeheartedly that a lot of this is going to have to be evaluated. But from what I am seeing and from all the phone calls that I've made to friends, contacts, the suggestion is there was plenty of intelligence. The question is, why wasn't the target hardened, so to speak? Why wasn't the Capitol protected to a greater extent? These are open questions. And again, it has to be looked at holistically.
A number of questions about the laptops, the phones, legislators, computers, the access that people had to them. Is everything as good as gone and compromised because access to those devices was left open?
In terms of the assault on the Capitol?
Yes, sorry, yeah.
Well, yeah, I guess it all depends on what was left open. If my iPhone is left open for a period of time, it's then locked, and with the very strong encryption capabilities and safeguards, so you can't access it. So these are the types of things that I think, again, the investigators are going to have to look at and try to chronicle exactly what happened, take inventory of what devices might be missing, what documents might be missing, what type of access to computers individuals might have had. It is going to be a monumental task to try to understand the full extent of the breach.
How do you see, here's a simple question. How do you see similar potential events in the future, like the breach, being prevented?
Well, I feel much better about the safeguards that are going to be in place for next week's inauguration as a result of the very, very hard lessons that were learned last week. For the inauguration, the Secret Service is the lead entity as far as security, and the acting Secretary of Homeland Security, incoming Homeland Security team, will have oversight of that. They will be working with the Capitol Police. But I've already seen some of the measures in terms of the barricades that have gone up, the National Guardsmen and women who have been deployed, the interaction. So I think as a result of that just awful breach of the Capitol, there is going to be overwhelming forces, I think, that are going to be available to ensure that things are going to be as secure as possible in the Capitol. Now, that raised the question, though, if the Capitol is going to be so hermetically sealed and protected, and hopefully it will be, are other locations going to possibly be targeted? We already know that the FBI, Chris Wray and others have talked to the state officials to ensure that measures are taken at the state capitals and other areas. So I do think that those who are out there who want to cause problems and want to carry out acts of violence, just like foreign terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, you will look for those targets that are vulnerable and that you can carry out an attack against. And so therefore, I think the security officials are going to have their hands full. And it's not just the Capitol, it's a much, much larger environment.
I agree. There's nothing more to add there. You harden one target, then what happens is deflection. The adversaries or terrorists find other targets, softer targets, other vulnerabilities. So I think DC is going to be pretty tight. It already is leading up to this weekend. I assure everyone who's listening, we'll see what happens in other capitals across the country.
Moving on or into threats, questions about both domestic and international do you feel that domestic radicals are the biggest threat that the U.S. faces?
I think at this time, it's certainly the most serious threat because it is so insidious. I think as both Chris and I have mentioned, a threat from within, whether you're talking about on the counterintelligence front or counterterrorism front, that threat from within is so much more difficult to prevent because they're already in your midst. And the fact that inside the United States, you have such availability to weapons, to even other types of material that are needed for violent attacks, makes the problem very difficult for the FBI and local law enforcement authorities. And again, I think what we've seen over the last several years is this growth in militias and white supremacist groups. And one of the things that I think the authorities are appropriately looking at is what type of foreign encouragement or support or assistance or advice is coming into some of these groups. We know that there are there are similarities as well as contacts between some of these domestic groups and, for example, neo-Nazis and other groups in Europe and other locations. So the authorities really have their hands full. But at the same time, they need to be cognizant that the foreign terrorist organizations continue to try to penetrate our defenses so they can carry out terrorist attacks for their own purposes and agendas. But I think the growth over the last several years of this domestic radicalism is something that the authorities are putting more and more resources and are looking at this right now as probably the most serious threat.
And I agree with John. I'd like to take everybody back 4 years, a little brief context. As I entered the Situation Room literally at 12:01 on Inauguration Day to work with Tom Bossert on counterterrorism issues at the White House, we were facing a pervasive and significant threat to commercial aviation that resulted in a laptop ban. That's all very public. We were very much zeroed in on accelerating with continuity the defeat ISIS work overseas. And candidly, I very much wanted to focus more effort on extremism, whether it's jihadists or racially, ethnically motivated violent extremisms. That's the term of art for far right extremists. We wanted to focus more on that initially. Candidly, we couldn't move toward that until several months in, but we managed to build language about neo-Nazis and far-right extremism into the national strategy that was published after I left the White House in 2018. Now, I can't give account. Somebody else will have to judge how the administration has done. It might be evident on working on far-right extremism, but it's a tough business, and I was always very confident that the FBI in particular has been working on domestic terrorism throughout the 1990s and certainly zeroed in on it post 9/11 as well. The priority, though, was focusing on ISIS and focusing on Al Qaeda. But clearly, and Christopher Wray has made this clear for some time, the FBI's #1 threat is right-wing terrorism, and like I said, racially, ethnically motivated violent extremism. That's a mouthful. So I am pleased that the administration built that language into a strategy. As I said, it's up to others to assess how they're done. And certainly the new administration is going to come in and really bore in on far-right extremism and also a terrorism prevention architecture that doesn't just focus on radicalization of jihadists, but also focuses on the far-right.
So moving on to some of the appointments that President-elect Biden has made, Avril Haines and Bill Burns for DNI and CIA director, a guest is wondering and saying how important the deputies for those roles will be, and should the deputies be intelligence professionals? What are some of the attributes that you think would be important in their deputies?
Absolutely right. The deputies are critically important. When I was at CIA, my first deputy was Michael Morrell, who I had worked with for many, many years inside of CIA. When Michael decided to retire, I looked outside for individuals who had not served in CIA. And so Avril Haines became my deputy, and she is now the nominee to be DNI. And then David Cohen from Treasury became my next deputy after Avril went back to the White House. I think it's important in those leadership teams to have people who are able to complement each other's experiences and background. And so Bill Burns, who I've worked with for decades, is just a supreme national security expert and has intimate understanding of the CIA's mission, but he never served inside of CIA. So I think it would be worthwhile that his deputy would at least have some experience in CIA as a way to have, sort of Mr. Inside and Mr. and Mrs. Inside and Mr. Outside. I just think that that team, and it's not just the deputy, it's a larger array of folks around both of those senior positions. But I do think that within, a very short time, you're going to get some more announcements about who is going to be the deputies in both of those organizations.
And also regarding Burns and Haines, what's on your short list for the issues for them to focus on right away?
Well, I think it's been unfortunate, but also I think it's been widely recognized that intelligence has not played a very large role in Mr. Trump's formulation of foreign policy. He has been very dismissive of a number of intelligence assessments and has been even disparaging of the work of law enforcement and intelligence professionals. My former colleagues at CIA, and I know throughout the intelligence community, they don't need to have great recognition of their work because they frequently work in the shadows and they know them when they join CIA, they're not going to be getting ticker tape parades. But what they want to know is that their work matters, that the intelligence that they collect, that the analysis that they provide, that the covert action programs they're involved in really are important to U.S. national security. And so I do think that Bill Burns and then Avril are going to ensure that the professionals, the intelligence professionals, are going to feel a renewed sense of not just purpose and mission, but also of the fact that what they're doing is really being used to protect, defend, and strengthen U.S. national security interests. The workforce, CIA, intelligence community, I think is second to none in terms of their dedication, their expertise. They want to do everything possible to protect and defend their fellow citizens. So I think having Bill Burns and Avril Haines and many of the others, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, these are individuals who have tremendous reputations for their national security expertise and engagement. So I do think there'll be almost an immediate renewed sense of commitment because I think they're going to feel valued, which is what they want.
Several people want to know, what is the most overlooked international threat or concern that faces us right now?
The most overlooked. Well, unfortunately, I think a number of them are known, but they are, if not ignored, they are downplayed. I really am concerned about climate change, the impact on international and national security, how the rising sea levels, changes in weather patterns are leading to the movement of peoples, migrations across borders, putting additional strains on governments, on economies. That has tremendous reverberations in terms of political and geostrategic interests as well as challenges. And the fact that a lot of individuals continue to, again, if not ignore, downplay not just the fact of, but the significance of, I think really puts us at disadvantage. The cyber environment, even though we have these intrusions, we talk about them, I still feel as though we're dealing with it in a rather ad hoc fashion. I think also this is an area that really requires a national, independent, sort of bipartisan commission to take a look at what we need to do in order to ensure the reliability, the security, the resilience of that digital environment, which within it holds our security, prosperity, and our well-being. But there are also other areas, genetic engineering that's going on in different parts of the world, the amazing technological developments that are transforming our lives. These are things that have a real profound effect over time. And unfortunately, I think the events of the day, consume our attention and focus. And some of these other areas evolve over time, and dealing with them becomes much more problematic because they have been allowed to fester. And therefore, one of the challenges for the incoming Biden administration is, what do we need to do in order to ensure that the wolves at the door don't get us? But there are also wolves down the street and wolves in the next neighborhood that we have to be aware of and plan for and try to mitigate the potential dangers and threats that I think we're going to be facing in the future. And it's not just the traditional geostrategic, political military ones. It's in the areas of science and technology and other types of things.
What about our relationship with Russia? Should we be doing more to deter Russia? Should we try for a reset with relations?
Yeah, reset has had a rather pejorative connotation to it recently. I think it's critically important that the United States and Russia have a productive and a constructive dialogue on a number of issues. We need to be able to restart the nuclear arms reduction talks with Moscow. Critically important. I do think we need to have a very honest and dialogue with Moscow about things that the Russians have been doing, to include in the cyber front, to include in the efforts to undermine democracy and democratic governments abroad. It's going to be, I think, a very difficult conversation with them. We have to make sure that Mr. Putin understands that it's a new day in Washington, that the Biden administration is not going to give Mr. Putin and Russia a pass, as I believe has happened on too many issues over the last 4 years. But it is important that the two largest nuclear powers in the world have a modus vivendi on some of these very important bilateral issues that affect global stability. Same is true with our relationship with China. We need to ensure that there's going to be a productive and constructive dialogue with China to address trade issues, cyber issues, North Korea's ballistic missile and nuclear program, South China Sea, such a full range, even a greater range of issues with China. And I do know that the Biden administration is planning to deal with both of those countries in a measured manner, having eyes wide open about the threats that both those countries pose, but at the same time recognizing that they are going to have to be dealt with. And we have to recognize that both countries play a very important role in the world. And we need to find ways to be able to address outstanding issues with both of them.
As a follow-up on Russia and the cyber attack, do you feel that that the incursions were timed when we were focused elsewhere, lawmakers were focused elsewhere, or was it just the standard, this was just when they were going to do this attack? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what I understand of the intrusion suggests to me that this was something that was planned over the course of many years. If in fact the intrusion did take place as a result of a software update that this firm SolarWinds was doing for the government, they would have had to get this into that system in the supply chain and be able to integrate that malware well in advance. At least according to press reports, it seemed to have gotten into U.S. government systems and networks last spring and was lying there for many months before it was even detected. But I bet you that it was a work in progress over the course of the preceding years. These issues related to supply chain, whether you're talking about physical materials and items, or you're talking about things that take place in that digital environment as far as updates, this is the type of thing that Russia, I think, really has spent a lot of time on over the years. And I wouldn't be surprised if they have other things in train. And so, again, we have to always have our radar up to see if we can find these various intrusions and penetrations, trying to understand their purpose, their capabilities, and as soon as they're detected, if they get into systems, there needs to be an immediate mitigation strategy as far as preventing propagation, preventing damage, and to take appropriate, counter steps.
Yeah, and I would just interject to draw a distinction. All last year, we talked about the possibility of wide-scale disruptions on Election Day, hacking. That didn't happen, and it was reported that Cyber Command, National Security Agency, was very much involved with defending forward and did an extraordinary job protecting our election process, our infrastructure, so to speak. At the same time, to draw a distinction, this other operation we just talked about was really about espionage. And whether that took attention away, that's another open question. Whether we were focused so much zeroing in on this continuation of election interference by Russia or not. Again, I don't have the fidelity or clarity on that, but it's an interesting question because we did a very good job of protecting Election Day. Or maybe it was that there was enough disinformation, misinformation already, they didn't need to continue. Or was Russia, did they feel like they were on notice? We were watching. It's an interest, the United States was, it's an interesting question.
shifting gears, would you want to comment on what the U.S. position should be on Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, who's being held for ransom paid by Iran to the U.K.?
Well, I think all these cases are, in many respects unique. There are different motivations sometimes when if a country detains somebody as opposed to a terrorist group. And it's difficult, at least for me, based only on press reporting, what's in social media, to understand the facts of these cases, to find out whether or not individuals were involved in some type of, intelligence activity, or whether or not this is something that a government or an organization is trying to leverage to extort or to manipulate other actors. So I just think that governments have an obligation when any of their citizens are seized overseas to try to do everything possible to understand exactly what these individuals have done, what the governments are charging them with, ascertain the facts. Sometimes, U.S. citizens abroad feel that even if they violate laws, the United States government should come and get them out. No, that's not the case. But there are, unfortunately, people like, Bob Levinson, Austin Tice, and others who are targeted purely because they are Americans. And this is something that I think the U.S. government has to work frequently with third parties, intermediaries, in order to try to get their release.
And the good news on that front, I don't know that case that well, but I would underscore that I believe there's been excellent continuity between administrations on our hostage work, as John indicated. Robert O'Brien, excellent work, and so isn't the current head of SPIHA, the Special Presidential Envoy, Carstens. The bottom line is I think that the administration coming in, we accepted continuity from them, we being in the NSC early days of the Trump administration. I think that will continue. So we're on a good trajectory. It's a tough story because countries keep rolling up hostages like Iran, or arresting people for espionage charges, etc. Russia's held a bunch of individuals, or at least one that I know of, not a bunch, are unlawfully detained, arguably, or on trumped up charges, no pun intended, certainly. So it's a tough issue.
We have very little time, but I'm going to try to squeeze in one very interesting question. Have you seen nations turn back a tide of unbridled populism successfully? What are warning signs that things are getting worse? What are signs of hope that things are getting better? Can you answer that in 1 minute?
No, I can't answer it in 1 minute, but I can try to at least touch upon it. Globalism is a fact of life. This world is becoming much more interconnected, and globalization has really, I think, benefited the human condition as we're able to communicate, to be able to share ideas, technology, so much around the globe. But I think we also have to recognize that globalization has had an uneven impact between countries as well as within societies. And a lot of people have benefited from globalization. And if you live in cities and you're able to take advantage of education and technology, the world's globalization is very positive. But if you're living in rural areas or areas that have been disadvantaged, or because the factory that you and your parents and grandparents worked at for many years has closed because of outsourcing, you really are opposed to this globalization move, and also migration coming into your country, people who look different than you and believe, have faiths different than you, and languages different. There's a sense of your national identity is being diluted. This is all to say that these factors have given rise to populism because of this inequitable distribution of wealth, income, opportunity, you name it. And so I do think that the phenomenon, which is a global phenomenon of populism in many different parts of the world, is something that is going to be challenging governments from here on. And it cannot be dismissed, and it cannot be disregarded in any way, because it's a real phenomenon. It's affecting the lives, well-being, and future of many, many people around the globe. And so I do think that there is a need for government leaders around the world to be able to recognize some of the factors and conditions that are leading to these populist movements. And some of them have a violent dimension to them, but there needs to be, I think, a better understanding of some of the factors that have led to the growth. And if there is recognition of those factors, I think it's going to be the beginning of trying to address them in a manner that tries to ensure that there's going to be a lessening of the polarization that has resulted, as well as the tensions and even the violence that unfortunately have manifested themselves.
So I can't think of a specific country that as a exemplar, but I will say that the future really we have to reinforce the point that besides investigations and arrests, we have to focus, like John said, on grievances, understanding the information environment to include social media and the implications of weaponization, in quotes, of social media. It's a social phenomenon. And we have, as I said, we have to work on a cogent prevention architecture that doesn't just focus on the last threat, jihadists. We have to focus on radicalization across the board. And none of this will be easily done. But I truly believe healing will follow in time. But we have to focus on those softer areas, in the underlying grievances, in the root causes. As I freely admitted, that wasn't priority day one 4 years ago, but it certainly is a priority for any future administrations that deal with their own population. And we can't poo-poo those underlying grievances, but they're certainly not an excuse for political violence.
Well, I want to thank you both for being open to all kinds of questions and answering so thoughtfully. And I want to apologize to the probably 50 people whose questions weren't answered. It did not reflect on the quality of the question. It reflected on the fact that we have to wrap up. This has been so enlightening, such an important conversation. I thank you both so much. I really want to thank Accenture Federal Services. Again, as I mentioned, we can't do this sort of event without them. They are really keeping us alive. We have lots of programs coming up. We have Frank Figliuzzi on January 21st at noon, discussing the FBI way. So we like to keep these programs free. We like to have you with us. We thank you so much. Any final words, brilliant speakers?
I just want to again express my appreciation for being invited, and I think the International Spy Museum really provides an outstanding service, particularly to young Americans who want to have a better sense of the role of intelligence in our national security and in the world. And so again, I just think that given where we are, and because of the things that we've talked about over the last hour, the challenges are significant. And therefore, the more understanding there is of these challenges, as well as the capabilities the United States and others bring to bear in order to address them, I think that is a necessary component of being able to move forward into the future.
Amanda, again, thank you. Thanks to our Spy Museum team that puts this together. And John, it was a privilege to do this with you, kick off the new year. And again, I want to thank Accenture, our friends at Accenture, and really underscore how much we appreciate their support to the International Spy Museum. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Stay well.